Right, good morning, colleagues. If we can just make our way to our seats and settle down, stop exchanging business cards and Facebook pages and so on and so forth. Right, so I'm not Lily. And I guess those of you, and most of you in the room would know Lily, would kind of recognize that right off that this is not Lily Art standing in front of you. I'm standing in for Lily, and with her apologies, Lily contracted the flu. As you know, Lily travels all around the world to places that many of us have never heard about to do amazing work in gender-based violence and lately on terror, working on terror and terrorism. So she must have picked up, in all her travels, she must have picked up a flu somewhere, and she's paying the price for that amazing work right now. So I said, no, I'll stand in. I was actually supposed to be in a different session, and then Guy twisted my arm off and said, no, I'll be in this session because it is to do with something that's very important, which is campus security and safety. And I guess for all of us in the room, what is close to our hearts is our student body and their experiences with violence on campus. So we're very fortunate that we have 4 colleagues this morning who have been doing extensive research and gathering the evidence and the information to all our questions about what is happening on our campuses currently in South Africa, and how, they're going to kick me afterwards, but it's fine, and understanding gender-based violence on our campuses and in its many manifestations. So you will also notice that there's only 3 presenters this morning. All right, so we have a little bit more time to be able to engage with our colleagues around these very important questions. So the first speaker for the day is Stella Musungu, and she is a peer program coordinator at the University of Cape Town, of course. And her focus area is HIV/AIDS, Inclusivity in the Change Unit, HICU. She holds a master's degree of philosophy in program evaluation, of course from UCT. And her position at HICU entails the coordinating of the peer evaluation and education program on campus and managing the training of our peer educators and student leaders. So she's at the coalface of training the people, the students that work with our student body directly as peer educators and counselors. As a project officer, she conducts evaluations for HICU on the campus and projects. Her interests lie in program evaluation and capacity building among young people. She's also published in the International Journal of Industry and Higher Education and the South African Journal for Nursing and Midwifery. Thank you very much, Stella.
Good morning, delegates. Thank you for that kind introduction. As earlier introduced, I'm Stella Musungu, and I'm based in the HIV/AIDS, Inclusivity and Change Unit at the University of Cape Town. I'm here this morning to present to you about an evaluation of a gender-based violence and bystander intervention workshop that are within our university residences. But before I get to that part of how the evaluation will unfold, I'd like to present to you the nature of work or the kind of work that our peer educators have been doing within the residences and the kind of discussions that they've been holding within the residences and what kind of format those discussions have taken. So the aim of these residence-based workshops are really to enable our students to understand the link between gender-based violence and HIV and increase their knowledge in that capacity, and for them to be able to hold conversations and speak to their peers about gender-based violence behavior, and to enable them to have the ability to engage in reframing gender norms on campus, changing their attitudes and self-perceptions around that topic. For them to be able to know when to refer their peers to appropriate structures on campus, like psychological or support services structures, and really to enable the students to learn how to become empowered bystanders and to know what type of response or what nature of action for them take in cases where they find themselves experiencing or witnessing incidences of gender-based violence, and to equip our peer educators who facilitate these workshops and hold these conversations with the skills on how to facilitate a gender-based violence related workshop. So these are our peer educators. We call them agents of change education because they educate around mainly social justice issues, HIV, gender-based violence, and a whole range of those transformation-related issues. We select about 30 to 35 peer educators, and they come from across our faculties and across residencies. So what's the format of the workshop that they present within the residence setting? It's really a face-to-face interaction. And once they're trained, they're paired up to facilitate small groups of between 5 to 20 students. These workshops are voluntary, so this means that students who come to the workshops and participate take part at their own free will. We do try to encourage them to attend with incentives, provide them with snacks, and encourage them to attend, just so we can get them to the space and ensure that the discussions really do happen. Because some students, once they get to the space and they see there's no food or there's no cool drink, there's not really any incentive for them to actually engage in a discussion. So we've tried to provide snacks to get them there. The workshops take the form of interactive discussions and role plays. You know, as students question, they engage in debate, and what the peer educators do is they ensure that they set ground rules at the beginning of the workshop, and they ensure that the space is confidential, that the discussions take place in a non-judgmental manner, and that everyone is invited to contribute to a space where they feel comfortable. So it's important for them to set those ground rules, because the information shared most of the time is of a sensitive nature, so that needs to happen. And of course, we share contact details of psychological and support counseling services. These are provided in case anyone needs them. And at the end of the workshops, our participants are requested to fill out an evaluation form that we that enables us to get feedback about, one, how they've experienced the workshop, whether the peer educators have been able to create a space for them to have that dialogue, and whether the workshop has been delivered as it should be. Our peer educators not only deliver workshops, but they do take part in campaigns against sexual violence, harassment, or rape. So they work very closely with student bodies on campus to show their support and to continue engaging in these dialogues. So the active participants, they get out of the residences and of the workshops and go to spaces where individuals are really speaking against this nature of assault. So we have been doing these workshops for quite a long time, and at the end of the workshop sessions, we do get about a total of about between 400 to 500 students coming to the workshops. But of course, that's not enough. We haven't managed to reach a large number of students as we would like to reach. And our students within the protests have called for more education to happen, for these messages to be disseminated to a large group of students on campus. So that means we need to work better and to do better and to work smarter. So this is something new that we are going to try. And what we have done is to translate the face-to-face workshop interaction into an online tool. which we have developed via SurveyMonkey and embedded onto our Haiku website. And it contains multiple choice exercise about perceptions around GBV, research and statistics in South Africa, and it contains video messages with instructions on how to complete each section. And it invites, within the workshops, there are messages about key people in the area speaking against gender-based violence. So those are some of the exercises that are in the tool. We are anticipating that the online workshop will attract more students, those who are not able to come to the face-to-face workshops, to participate in these discussions. And it's also a tool that can be used in the classroom to foster learning. This tool is not replacing anything that is currently happening, but it's rather adding to what is already existing, and we're hoping that we will get more students to interact online and engage with this material online. However, we do believe that it needs to be rolled out in combination with educational strategies, such as campaigns, seminars, more dialogue, and more discussion. So this is just an addition to. So it has been developed this year, and we would like to evaluate it. We would like to evaluate its effectiveness next year. So an evaluation will therefore be conducted once students have engaged with this tool. So that brings me to evaluating the online tool within evaluating the online tool. And I just mentioned earlier on that we've been doing these workshops within the residences for quite a long time. And in implementing the online evaluation, a process and outcome evaluation will be conducted. The key question here is whether the Haiku online program has changed participants' knowledge and attitudes and efficacy to address GBV and HIV transmission on campus. Evaluation of objectives include being able to ascertain if the workshop has been implemented as intended, if there is any understanding of the processes and perceptions of the workshops by those who are involved, and to determine the short-term outcomes, whether those have been achieved. I must acknowledge the project sponsors for this project. It's part of funding received from the National Institutes of Health in the US by UCT and Brown University. It's a collaboration project called SASH, and the project sponsors are supervisors Prof. Chris Colvin and Prof. Mark Lowry, UCT Faculty of Health Sciences and Division of Social Behavior Sciences at Brown University. The Haiku staff, which I am part of, is the implementing team who are also involved in the program. So those are some more of the short-term outcomes continued. The evaluation has already received ethics approval. In terms of participant sample, we will randomly select from 4 mixed-sex campus residences. That's because our workshops attract a mixed group of people. And the research design will be a phased trial with both intervention and control group. In phase 1, a pretest will be administered to all. The intervention group will receive the intervention, but the control will not. And a post-test will therefore be administered after that. In phase 2, the control group will not receive the intervention, and a post-test will be administered to all participants after the control has received the intervention. In terms of data analysis, both quantitative and qualitative data will be obtained. Quantitative data will be analyzed by SPSS, and qualitative data will be analyzed by Imbizo and grounded theory. We will conduct some more interviews with both the control and the intervention group. We're hoping that the recommendations, once the evaluation has been completed and results analyzed, will be used to inform future GBV prevention programs. And the ideal goal here really is for us to share learnings with other universities who are interested in developing appropriate sexual assault and GBV responses in their institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella. I think it's always interesting to hear about those type of research instruments that's being developed to try and gauge the health and well-being of our student body. Our next presenter is Sinegugu Duma. She's an associate professor in the Division of Nursing and Midwifery at the University of Cape Town. She holds a PhD from UCT, a Master's in Nursing Education from the University of KwaZulu-Natal, and a B.Sc. in Nursing Administration and Nursing Education from INISA. She completed her research or her undergrad studies at the Natal College of Nursing. She also holds a certificate in sexual assault, forensic nursing, and postgraduate courses in gender-based violence and forensic nursing from the Johns Hopkins School of Nursing in Baltimore, USA. Her research is on recovery from sexual assault, the health sector's response to gender-based violence, and the prevention of sexual violence in higher education institutions. She's also the chairperson of, and this is very important, which I think colleagues would like to know about, is that you are the chairperson of the Sexual Assault Response Team at UCT, which is the first of its kind at our university. You also serve in many of the national and international professional nursing associations, including the South African Forensic Nursing Association and many, many others. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for the kind introduction. And thank you to Stella for introducing what is happening at UCT. And it's such a great pleasure for me to share this podium with Stella. Not only is she part of the Sexual Assault Response Team at UCT, she is also an ex-Baxterite, and wherever I go, I carry that cap, and I'm sure she's carrying that cap. That is one of the best residences at UCT, and I'm glad that you haven't stopped working with the residences. That's part of our work that we did as myself and the research team. That's what I'm going to present today. But the presentation, really, the structure is, I'm going to share with you why we started engaging with this kind of work as early as 2013, and what we knew at that time and what we already know, even now, about sexual violence in universities, what we know about the influence of student leaders on campus, and then I'll share some of the projects that we're doing, but the actual one that I'm going to talk about is the pilot that we started in 2013. And of course, I'm going to talk about that one in particular, its methods and the findings, and if we still have time, conclusions. I'm not used to 12 minutes of presentations. I'm a qualitative researcher, and I'm a storyteller, and I just don't know about this 12 minutes, so I'll stop when I have to. So why did we even engage on this with my research team? And I've seen some members of the research team, and I must acknowledge them. Professor Naima Abrahams is sitting there, and yeah. So we knew that as over 50% of students who are enrolled in higher education are undergraduate students, and 58% of those are women. We also knew that about 59% of women students are in university residences, at least at UCT. But we also knew from literature that constant actual and perceived threats to personal safety and fear of sexual victimization does affect one's academic achievement. And we also knew that improving safety on campus, especially in the residences, is an important but often neglected area for academic support of students. So these are the things that pushed us as early as 2013. But we also knew that we could come up with anything, but if that wasn't informed by students, it wouldn't work. So we knew that we needed, so we knew also that we needed student-informed strategies in order to improve safety on campus residences. We also know there are certain things that we know about sexual violence in universities. I put that cover of a Times magazine because I got this when I landed, I think it was in New York in 2013. It was talking about rape as a crisis in higher education. So we know that sexual violence is a global crisis, especially in universities. And South African universities, being the global village, South Africa being the global village, are also not immune. In fact, we've seen this year how we are part of that global village as South African universities. And unfortunately, unlike other countries like the USA, where there are mandatory reporting of sexual violence, in South Africa, we don't have that. And we do have policies. Most of the universities in this country, if you ask them about sexual violence and sexual harassment policies, they will be so quick to take them up, and they will be so quick to tell you that they have services, but really when you get down to evaluation of how those are implemented, that's another issue. We also knew that the reporting in this country in particular, but also in other countries, is not that great. Probably because university managers want to protect the reputation of their universities. There is also an issue of, if you report, and it's a misnomer though, that if you report that your university has more sexual violence than others, it will affect the ratings of the university. My belief is the more we know is, if people were to say how much is happening, maybe as a mother or as a parent out there, I would know that that university is doing something about that problem. So it's a misnomer that if you report sexual violence as a university, you won't have, your ratings will be reduced, and you won't have staff coming to your university and students coming to your university. And it's something that we are trying to help university management to understand. But we also know that people are not reporting because of self-blame. Probably the person has been raped or has been violated in one way or another, would think that I can't report because what was I doing in his room? Why was I drinking with this person? So even from the very same victims and survivors, reporting is an issue. But what is great is that we know that sexual violence can be prevented. So we also were forced by what we know about student leaders in university residencies. Student leaders are custodians of traditions and cultural practices in residencies. And as custodians, they can protect or unfortunately perpetuate certain traditions, including rape culture that is happening in most of our universities today. They also can be partners in informing development of safety awareness and sexual violence prevention interventions, which I'm glad that Stella and her team are tapping into students for these interventions. We also know that as future leaders, student leaders can take a stand against sexual violence. But also we knew that we needed them as key informants of the communities that they serve. So our work, study setting, or our setting is the University of Cape Town, but for the pilot part, we started with 5 undergraduate residencies, which were geographically close, and we used 2 male residencies and 3 female residencies. We were guided by the community readiness model, which looks at how far are people ready for engaging to tackle any community problem. So the reason why we use this model was to determine the student leaders' level of awareness and readiness to tackle safety issues and sexual violence on campus by exploring the student leaders' perceptions of safety and fear of sexual victimization among students. And just like the community readiness model, it looks both at research, in other words, how you determine the level, but also at educational workshops to help people to move to other levels if you find that maybe they are at no awareness or at denial. So we used both the research, we collected data, and that data informed whatever educational workshops that we had with student leaders. So as key informants, as part of the pilot, we had 37 student leaders, 22 females and 15 males. And we used a series of focus group discussions, mixed groups, and we followed mostly what Stella has done about the snacks and choosing the appropriate times, mostly Sunday afternoons. And then based on the data that we collected, of course, then we had educational activities. And the data was analyzed thematically to help us to move, or to help the students to move to the next level based on what we identified them to be on the community readiness model. So how we conducted the focus group discussions, the questions were looking at, they had to reflect on the following questions. What do you consider as threats to your personal safety and of course that of other students on daily basis while in the university residences and on campus? And what sexual violence threats do you think confront female students on daily basis on campus and in university residences? And then of course we did content analysis and thematic analysis of that data. These were facilitated of course by trained researchers. I'm just going to, because I'm looking at the 6 minutes, and I'm going to just concentrate on the findings under the 2, but we identified 6 themes: perceptions of false safety, tolerance of rape culture, that's what I'm going to concentrate on for today, space-related threats to personal safety, constant worry about sexual victimization, and self-protecting behaviors, of which we won't cover because of the 12 minutes. On the perceptions of false safety, one student leader had this to say: the level that we are at and the spaces that we share here and even beyond campus, I've never felt like I had to be that type of woman who plays it safe on campus. So feel safe, but it's false safety. And this male student leader said, I sometimes think we stress too much about things. I know it's a major problem out there, but we also need to live our lives and be happy with our lives. So you researchers now are bringing this as an issue. It's not happening. So we identify this as false safety. And then on the rape culture, there were quite a number of jokes about rape and about sexual violence, especially from the male student, but you also would be surprised even from the women. But this one in particular was, sex is like pizza. Even if it is bad, it is good. Even if it's cold or hot, it is good. Whether it's thick or thin, it's good. Whether it's from debonaires or scooters, it's plain good. Pizza is enjoyable anytime. So is sex. This came from a male student. But what was also surprising was that as he was saying this, his colleagues were also adding, which means it's something that they say every day. That's what it gave us as researchers. This one was, I do not feel like I'm at risk of major sexual violence per se, because I do not count catcalling as sexual violence. I think of it as just sexual harassment, so I just ignore it and walk as if it did not happen. I did not hear it. This came from a female student. So that's how wrong things have become accepted. There were quite a number, but because of the 12 minutes, I just chose those 2. So just looking at where they were at, according to the at stages of community readiness, when we looked at these, we thought, much as we couldn't say they were not aware of sexual violence, but we could put them at the first 3, that perceptions of safety and tolerance really left them at vague awareness, even denial, if you like it. So which helped us to say we needed to then plan something for the next workshops. So we had to help them to move to pre-planning, hence our workshops on sexual violence, where we spoke about value clarification, what sexual violence is and all that. And at the end of that, we then gave them action charts, where after they've understood what sexual violence is and what are the safety issues on campus, then they had to tell us what they think needed to be done. And then Talking about other projects, because the one that I just shared briefly was the pilot. We've been engaging in quite a number of them, but the most important one is the PhD project that has been done by Tanya. She was supposed to be here. She's my student and Professor Abraham's student. We co-supervise her. She has engaged men students as partners in prevention of sexual violence on campus using the Sonke Gender Justice One Man Can intervention and then adapting it to the university community. And she has come up with great findings on how to adapt and use that for university settings. And of course, we're engaged on sexual violence on campus surveys. But of course, the major part or the major thing that has happened is, because if we go back to the stages, we've moved quite quickly from that period of denial to professionalization, almost all 9 stages of the community readiness. Even the Vice-Chancellor has now appointed me as the chair of the sexual assault response team, which just says that's how far we are if you go back to the community readiness model. I think that 12 minutes was covered nicely.
Let me just use my hat as whatever and ask you to briefly talk to the sexual assault response team for colleagues. I think people would be interested in knowing what is the function of this unit.
The sexual assault response team is collective of quite a number of colleagues. I've seen Shirley from Rape Crisis. I don't know where she's sitting now. And I've seen Dr. Tumi Mulife and quite a number of people. So the response team, it's a collective of people who are really concerned about both responding to sexual violence on campus, but also on prevention. So we are not necessarily replacing the services that are there on campus, but we are coordinating these and ensuring that the survivor receives the care and management that they need. And the first thing that we look at is the protection of the survivor. And we do that in so many ways, but the first thing that once a person has reported and has been taken to Victoria, we also work with Victoria Forensic Unit, which gives the actual care. But my role then becomes ensuring that the survivor is protected by, if it's in the same residences, by removing the perpetrator and ensuring that while the processes are continuing, the perpetrator is no longer in the same vicinity where the survivor is. We also plan and coordinate the prevention of sexual violence. And there are quite a number of things. It's new. I was only called one Friday afternoon by the Vice-Chancellor and saying, develop this. So most of the things are still to happen. The plans is that we are going to ensure that every student who enters UCT would have received at least an online preparation on the issues of consent, the issues of sexual violence and how to prevent it, and then later on we'll work collaboratively with the groups like Stella and others on the skilling on how to negotiate consent, because once you know, knowing about what is the consent, but also not knowing how to negotiate it's a problem. So those are the plans. But how we work is that we're looking at communication and advocacy, and we're looking at services, coordinating all the services that are there, and education. Yes, education. I think there are about 4 working groups. I can't remember the 4th one right now. But that is just how we are looking at ourselves as the sexual assault response team. It just says response, but it also looks at prevention as part of, and also research as part of that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for indulging us with and talking about this very important work that you're doing on the campus. And I think for those of us that that teach on campuses and are aware of these issues and the well-being of our students, we all have bumped up against the very same mechanisms, institutional mechanisms that are there to protect our students, but that they're also very difficult to access and penetrate and get information about what's going on with our students and ultimately wanting to develop responses to that. So we're very excited about the work that you are doing at UCT, and hopefully this work will spill over nationally to other universities in the country as well. Our next speaker is Crispin Hemson, and he is from the International Center for Nonviolence from the Durban University of Technology. Crispin is also then the director of the center at the Durban University of Technology, and he was formerly the head of the School of Education of the University of Natal. So you helped to shape some of the minds that are in the room today, so we really appreciate that. Your research interests include violence and transformative pedagogies, and at present you play a major role in the development of a foundational model for all DUT first-year students focused on the issues of self, diversity, and society. Thank you, Crispin.
I must say I'm a bit, I think I must have written that, the title in the early hours one morning, because when I look back at it, I'm a bit embarrassed. It's like me sort of, come on, Majita, we are going to sort out violence. And I hope, as you'll see, it's not quite actually what's been happening, thank God. I'm wearing the clothing of the group, which is called Amajita, that I have been working with. We have this very nice logo designed for us by one of the lecturers in graphic design, and on the back, a slogan of the group about developing men as leaders who care. So it's really a report of an intervention. As it'll become clear, it's not so much my intervention as the intervention by a group of men. That is the research question that I developed. But I'm not sure it's really quite the correct research question, because this has become an action research project, and it's more, the research question may be rather about myself and how my practice, what I'm learning from my practice through involvement with this group. So very briefly, I don't need to go with this group through the issue of the high societal levels of South African violence, but just to emphasize that, of course, young men are very vulnerable in both roles, both as potential perpetrators and as potential victims of violence. And so we can't separate out the role of young men from all of the issues about gender-based violence. Secondly, as has already been covered here at different points, we now know a lot more recently about violence at South African universities, in South African higher education, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, homophobic violence, and there are various people here whom I'm sure have done research in these areas. So that's the backdrop. We don't know very much about violence at DUT, because we don't have sufficient studies yet, and only just starting that work. The theoretical framework for this work has been around the issue of hegemonic masculinity and hegemonic masculinities. And I think relevant here is the concept of hypermasculinities amongst men who are marginalized. These are not the powerful men of society, but who nonetheless assert an aggressive form of masculinity, which has connections to hegemonic masculinity. So amongst men who may be poor, but assert strongly the dominance of men over women and the dominance of some men over against other men who are seen as weak, vulnerable, and so on. So where this particular intervention started was that ICON, the International Center of Nonviolence, became part of a research partnership involving various partners, led by Professor Claudia Mitchell at McGill, Professor Lebo Moletsane at UKZN. And initially, when teaching on this Cornerstone 101 module at DUT, I asked if there were young women who wanted to join a group of young women who would focus on the issue of sexual violence as part of that research partnership. So, in fact, a group of young women joined. They formed a group which then gave itself the name Girls Against Sexual Violence and Abuse, or GASVA. And I worked initially with them before handing over to a woman who is a master's student. And her research project is now around the leadership of the work of that group. But even at the time I made that announcement to the class, there were a couple of men making comments, like, well, what about us? And then these men approached me and said, look, we've got a group now. We are calling ourselves Amajita, guys or brothers. And we want you to help facilitate this group. So this started in September last year. Just to go to the model of action research, I think probably a large number of people have some knowledge of this, but it's basically seen as the researcher's intervention in an iterative process of developing a project, developing an intervention, enacting that, collecting data from the intervention, reflecting on it, and then replanning. And gradually, depending on the form of action research, one moves to strengthen the intervention, change the way it operates to find a more effective way of working. So, from the beginning, from our first meeting in September, it became clear that men wanted to speak, and they wanted to tell stories about their lives. And if there's been any one way of describing what has happened in the work of Amajita, the prevailing model is perhaps one of narrative therapy. A critical element from my mind from the beginning was that we need to build the highest possible level of safety within the group. And the theory here would be that under conditions of safety, people can revisit experience. And in that revisiting of experience, it's possible to engage with imagination, with a sense of alternative possibilities. And I think this is important because it also allows the development of the thinking from the group, not towards a particular outcome. So we've never said, are we aiming to make you into real men or some concept of an existing model of how men should be, but simply to work from that experience onwards. I have not yet got ethical clearance for a study of the experiences of the men. So this is an account really from my perspective of my practice and what I've had to deal with. I've avoided going into details then of men's experience as reported in the group. Clearly there's anonymity. And yeah, we may need to come back to the issue of the ethics of this work. At the first meeting, the bulk of the time in the first meeting was spent discussing the issue of safety and how we were going to achieve safety within the group. What did men feel was the critical thing needed for them to be able to participate fully and freely? So, now this is going back a bit, I think. Should have put this before. But look at DUT, basically that, we need to know who the students are at DUT, about 25,000 students. And DUT students are generally from fairly financially limited backgrounds, largely rural, most students on NSFAS, a large number struggling because they don't quite qualify for NSFAS, majority Zulu. And then the module, I'll come back to the issue of the module. It is a new module. It's the first module in a program of general education. So right from the beginning, men wanted to speak without any reticence, and they insisted, in fact, at the first meeting, I asked a question about, can you give me an example of a good experience of being with other men? And what I got was pretty troubling experiences. And in this process, the role of facilitator, you might notice that I am not a young Zulu man. And I was cast in this role of being, it was made explicit, no, you are the father we did not have. Whatever my feelings about that role, that is the role I have been put in. And at one point I was told, I was trying to talk about the experience of white people, and I was told, but you're not really white either. So I said, no, I think I'm white. No, you're not. So, but one of the main messages that comes through that men keep articulating publicly and openly about this work is that we are vulnerable and we can be victims, and we mustn't pretend that we are tough. So the other day, one young man talking publicly said, we are not bulletproof. Just because we are men, we are not bulletproof. We can be badly hurt. We can be emotionally hurt. We have physical and emotional scars that we have to deal with. And then some of the comments that initially troubled me a bit was like, why do we have 16 days of activism against violence against women and children? So where does the violence against us come into this? I'll come back to that point. But why have I said this is mobilizing people on the issue of violence? Because really that is the main thing that people have been speaking about. But having said that, it is not entirely true for everyone in the group. So I remember in one session we were talking about anger, and we came to the one young man and he said, well, I don't think I have a problem with anger. He says, I come from, and he comes from the same sort of social background as everyone else. He's a friend of theirs. He says, I come from a home with a loving mother and a loving grandmother. Nobody ever hit me. I never hit anybody. He says, I just don't get very angry. So people say, well, what do you do when people get nasty to you? Like, well, he says, they must have some problem. It's not my problem. I just look at them and I walk away. And the other guys sort of, is that possible? Yeah. A big thing that comes up is the issue of the role of fathers in families. And if if we have a moral panic about absent fathers, I think we should, forget it. Sometimes I think, if only some of these fathers had been absent. But frequently people saying, I do not want to grow up like my father. It's a strong theme. But also it's not just families, it's schools and communities where Violence is simply endemic. Now, the group developed a mission statement. We had this developing men as leaders who care, but then they went for a different one. And I actually think it is quite accurate, revealing and developing the humanity of men. The sense that the humanity of men has been obscured through stereotypes, through men having to harden themselves in response to traumatic experience, and then ubudoda abu kulelwa, the sense of you may be young, but you're growing into being a man. You're, in that sense, always, from when you're young, a man. So there's strong pressure from the group to speak out publicly on these issues. And they want to be seen to be speaking on the issues, which of course creates problems of confidentiality. Earlier this year, both groups did a presentation to students on the different classes of Cornerstone 101 on the issue of gender-based violence. The Amajita did a drama. On Monday, in fact, after I'd submitted this, two of the men from Amajita and one young woman from Gazva spoke at another class of Cornerstone about the work, why they're involved in this work, what are the kind of issues that men have to face and that women have to face, including gender-based violence on campus. The media, they want to speak on media, they want to speak on radio. And one of the things we did to prepare for that was the idea of we talked about how we could do this, because the strength has been in the stories, the storytelling. The stories communicate so much. And sometimes the ideas about people misunderstand men are not that kind of, don't convey that much. So we then thought, well, what we would do was possibly get people to tell stories, but not their own stories. So clearly we'd have to negotiate amongst the group which stories can be told and who's going to tell. So people would speak as if I'm the person involved, but they would make it clear, actually, that's not my experience. It's experience I know about. We haven't yet actually got to speak on DUT radio, but we're going to. Really the concluding point I want to make is this. I was worried about this idea of a kind of Me Too-ism. Women are getting all of this gender awareness, what about the men? And it becomes like, why is there not more support for men? Are we being sufficiently respected? So you can understand how that becomes a problem. And yet, then I thought about it and I realized, this problem is coming purely from the way we set this up. Previously, I'd worked with a very slightly younger group of high school students. And we did work strategically, separately, for people to speak really freely. But we very quickly brought them back with each other. And yes, there was some conflict between men and women, but those issues of communication were quite readily resolved. And now the men are saying, we're scared of meeting with Gazva because they're too angry. And it makes a point about gender relations that these can't be resolved. Men can't just resolve these relations on their own. And this is a quotation from the Cornell and Messerschmitt's paper on hegemonic masculinity that points about the cure lies in taking a consistently relational approach to gender. If the men really want to construct a different sense of themselves as men, but then they can't do that just on their own. There has to be some process of engagement with women. And so we go back then into the the pattern of shifting the way we operate as action researchers. Bye.
Thank you very much, Crispin. It's great to hear about the voices that's out there and the narratives that we share. So we're going to take, we've got about half an hour for questions and discussion. So we're going to take the first, let's take the first 4 questions to the panel, and then they'll respond, and then we'll see how much time we've got left. Let's have the first 4 questions. There's one.
Morning.
Hang on. People.
Good morning. This question is directed to Sinegugu. I found your presentation interesting. I would just like to ask about the concept of negotiating consent. Thank you.
Hi, my question is also for Sinegugu. I'm Abigail, I'm the chair of the Gender and Sex Project at UCT. And I wanted to ask, what is the underexploited spaces to have those kinds of conversations on UCT campus or any university campus? Is it orientation weeks during residences? Is it SRC events, or is it actual lectures for which you have attendance registers for? Because I think a common theme in the kinds of work that we do, just for background, Gender and Sex Project does workshops and life orientation classes in high schools on gender, sexuality, and gender-based violence. And one of the main reasons why the Gender and Sex Project does it with schools and classes is because students are present, and it's a whole it's the whole class, as opposed to people who self-select to go to workshops, because usually they're the ones who need it the least. But so the reason why I asked this is because in our dealings with the university, in our interview a few weeks ago, we were told by the Student Society Services that we do not concentrate enough on the UCT community, and that is unacceptable when the UCT is in crisis about issues around sexual assault. And so we're looking to do more work on the university campus, but where do we do that where we feel like we're not preaching to the choir?
Hi, my name is Azwe. My question goes to Sinegugu. I'm just interested to know that have you find in these workshops, have you find anything that has implicated leadership or teachers? Because I'm thinking that because of the power relations between the students and the teachers, there is some sort of implications in terms of perpetuating sexual violence from the leadership structures.
It's fashionable, Sinegugu, unfortunately for you. The question is also coming to you. I remember around about 2007, we, as student leadership, went for an induction, and all I can remember is that we were given a lot of lessons about Karl Marx, but we never. And then the expectation was that we would come back and lead 16,000 others. And that was a very bad idea, because the issue of gender-based violence came and we were out of our depth to deal with it. So I want to check whether the modern day leaders and inductions, because I know that almost all universities there's always going to be an induction for the leadership, whether this issue is now part of the content. My second question comes to Mr. Crispin. I just want to test my understanding of gender-based violence. For me, gender-based violence is something that men are perpetrators of. They created the idea and they practice it. If it so happens that they might find themselves as victims, They are more like somebody who has created a gun to rob me in my house, and I take the gun and I point at you. So I'm still, when I'm pointing the gun to that person, I'm still not a burglar or somebody who has broken in. So if it so happens that men become victims, they are victims of something that they've created. So any woman who would perhaps victimize them is probably just applying their same terms of sexual relations rather than. So therefore, I can't find them to be victims of the same thing that they've created. Thanks.
Okay, Lynn Huff Corzine, I'm from University of Central Florida in U.S. Have one question and one comment. First, do you know when you're going to have, where you're going to place that sexual assault information? Because what we find is the students who are going through orientation, they can't even remember, one thing from another. And so, it's really important information for them, but they're just skimming through, going as fast as they can to get into the classes instead. So that's one of the things I learned from being the undergrad director for 3 years. They don't know anything about sexual harassment and what that means and so on, because they haven't listened closely. So have you thought about timing? The other one is for Crispin. Just a comment that I just supervised a dissertation that found the same exact thing as your young man said, that in fact the juvenile homicides for this group were lower if there was a mother who could sustain the household financially and no father, or it's even better if grandma's there. So it's kind of an interesting thing that we're beginning to see, change in family.
Thank you for insightful questions. I hope I will do justice to most of them. I will try and start with the first one, which was about negotiating consent. I've just returned from a conference in the US, and there's this book that was just introduced at that conference. It's a nice little book that I managed to read from the first page to the last page, just in the plane coming this way. The title of the book is Can I Kiss You? And these are the things, it talks about the things that we take for granted in relationships, in dating. And it says not only dating for younger people, but in all relationships up to people who are married. Things that we just take for granted. So it depicts how we just look at a person who just kiss and we think that the person who is more assertive is the right person. But it's teaching people that even for simple things as, Stella, can I ask you, I have a question for you. May I? Can I? So those are the things, and it has a lot of activities that I intend to use with the students later. As I say, there's going to be a part of skilling, of giving people skilling. So negotiating both the consent, negotiating, asking those pertinent questions about, can I hold your hand? Because we take those things for granted when we start dating. It talks about how we fail, when you get into dating, you think you can read people's verbal and non-verbal behaviors, but it says no. You don't have to. You have to check every time. So I have quite a number of exercises based on that book, but also based on the activities that we did just last week. And I intend to have that book probably not only just being in the library, but being part of the orientation at UCT. Of course, there may just be some constraints with the budget, but the book was actually being given freely to us. So, But the main thing is, it starts with asking just for holding hands, and all the other activities of negotiating whatever it is that people are going to engage in, not making assumptions that because she has come up, I asked for a date and she's here and therefore. So we're going to start from there on healthy relationships and then moving up from there. I don't know if that covers that question nicely, but there is a book. You can Google it. It's Can I Kiss You? That's the title of the book. And surprisingly, the people that I was sitting with in the plane thought it was a romantic book, and when I actually showed it to them what it was, they were quite surprised. And they started asking me what I'm doing for living. If I teach people on these simple questions about can I kiss you. So that's on the negotiating, which leads me to the next question, which was probably the last question about how we are going to stagger the training. We're going to look at, we've just been working on negotiating with Michigan University, who have started on the pre-entry, which is just giving people the information and what it means, what is sexual violence, the issue of consent. But so there's pre-entry, and then it's staggered in such a way that mid-term, that's when you start talking about issues including the healthy relationship. They have a relationship remix, which is also a program that we intend to use, and then we intend to then collaborate with the Stellas and other people and looking at other prevention interventions that are already there. So the information has to be staggered, because the belief is that if you give it as pre-entry, anyone and everyone is going to do it right because it's online. But how do you then evaluate if that which they did prior to getting onto UCT? The issue was, is it possible in Africa? And Michigan have started to work with Ghana, and at UCT it was clear that it's possible because even application to UCT is online. So that's what we're going to do. But then mid-term we will do it, and then the second semester we evaluate, and then after the evaluation, you then plan according to what you found after the evaluation. I guess I've covered that, the first and the last question. And then the issue on the spaces that are missed. There are quite a number of spaces that are missed. For instance, the very same pre-entry, it's going to be for every student, because I don't know whether it's because the students in the residences are a captured community. We all are focusing our efforts on the students in the residences. But as such, we've realized that sexual violence in the university, it happens in the whole university community, not only students, by the way, even staff, and staff to students, students to staff, and that. And those are all the communities and all the spaces that we haven't tapped into. And what we are also planning in doing, without just looking at that entry, which is going to be every other student at undergrad, then there's also planning of those that are entering at postgrad, because we have the system where we have some residences where we have all the three tier sectors. That is the undergrads up to PhD. There are about 2 residences that are like that. And what we're finding is that the senior are abusing the junior and vice versa. So even people who are coming at postgrad, they're going to have the same kind of information. And not only our students, we are also looking as such to be training the tribunal people, the people that actually sit and listen to these cases, because we've discovered how much they don't understand about sexual violence. You have people that have been acquitted because the questions that were asked from the survivors are questions like, if it was rape, why didn't you scream? How come you still slept the whole night in his room? And those are the things that we are realizing, that people who sit in university tribunals need their own training. managers, HODs and managers who issues of sexual harassment get reported to and think they can intervene instead of following the policy. There is so much work that still needs to be done. What we decided as SAT was that this year we are identifying gaps and trends, and then we are going to come up with interventions that are addressing those trends and gaps. For instance, just to add on some of the trends that we are finding is that not only we are concentrating on the university, but fortunately for SAT, because we're multi-sectoral, and we are now hearing from other partners of SAT who are, for instance, the people in Victoria who are saying there are students that are not raped on campus, but who are raped from some clubs. There's an identified club. We know that club most of the university students go to, but people are using that club as a hunting ground where they offer either a lift back to campus, and people who've been raped from there don't come to report to the services that are on campus, but go straight to our partner services. So we are using all the data. I think the past 6 months have been the period of collecting all the data, and as such, then we're going to really develop strategies to look at. So if we're looking at the spaces that are missing, the whole university community, we just need to identify who is doing what and how we can collaboratively work together as the people that are concerned. We're planning on having a summit sometime in April, being the Sexual Violence Awareness Month, and would call out for everyone and anyone who's doing work in this regard, and then identify other sectors within the university that we can look at. And then the other one was about leadership. Yes, the leadership was implicated both negatively and positively. And when we had as part of the workshops on the action charts, where we're asking people what they think are the actions that needed to be taken, there were quite a number of things that they indicated that this should be done by management. For instance, provision of self-defense training, as well as the very same thing about reviewing policies and everything. And so management was identified by students as another target that we should be looking at. There was a question about student leaders, how they were just trained about Karl Marx and how to be good leaders and all that. I may have indicated how we've found that as custodians of all the traditions and practices, we've just had House Committee, we call them interrogations, where there were quite a number of things that have come there which show about the cultural traditions that need to be tackled. Just 2 nights ago, female residents have gone to male residences where people have been called names. And these interrogations are when we are selecting or electing student leaders. So we're identifying that. As custodians, we have custodians of these traditional practices and cultures. I have already, as the member of SAT, written to people who organize orientation of all the student leaders, and have been invited for the whole of October. If you look at my calendar, it's going to be crazy, because I'm supposed to be going and talking, introducing both SAT and anything else related to sexual violence to all the student leaders in the induction programs. So we are realizing as UCT that don't just talk about how to be a leader when you are not talking about the issues that are happening on universities. And as I indicated in the presentation, that's one of the things that we knew, that they are custodians and they can take a stand. We need to partner with student leaders if we are going to come up with student-informed interventions. I don't know if I've left anything else.
I just want to build on what Sine just said around, there was a question that was asked around underexploited spaces to have these discussions. I want to speak from the peer education perspective, what challenges we've encountered and what the interactions have been like. Focusing more on orientation, one of the colleagues in this room mentioned that a lot of students receive a lot of information and they don't retain most of it. That's one of the observations that has been made at UCT during orientation week. Simply, when you look at orientation, the manner in which it's designed, it's really packed with a lot of information talks. There are a lot of sessions happening, and there's such a contestation for space, for venues, and so much needs to be done during that week. So we have this sensitive, important information about health, about personal issues that needs to be conveyed to nearly all the first years. And when you go, for example, to the Orientation Coordination Committee, which organizes orientation, everyone needs a space there. And if you're lucky, you get 15 minutes or 30 minutes. I must say that for the past couple of years, I have coordinated the peer education program. It's really been a struggle to get 40 minutes to talk about just HIV. And to unpack that in 40 minutes, it's just not enough. I mean, getting into gender-based violence and sexual violence, you just cannot convey all that information. So those are the challenges around Orientation Week. We really need to rethink how orientation needs to be run. There is faculty orientation and there is residence information. Same thing with residence information. There's just still so much that is happening there. It's important then to continue this kind of awareness and education throughout the year. It shouldn't stop. But we need to think very carefully about how we do that. And I think it needs to come from an institutional response. It needs to be mandated and supported by leadership. So I'm looking forward to all the pre-entry programs and what Sine just spoke about, and I'm waiting to see how that will span out, because we need that. That's important. The other space, without taking up so much time, is the day house. The day house where day students converge, students that are not in residences. We found that those students have specific needs, and therefore we need to take the content and the workshops to them. But we also need to identify peer educators or student leaders who are not in residence but are living off campus to be able to support that group of students. The final thing I want to say about consent, Sina, I would like to read the book. I haven't read it. I don't know if the book covered about being able to change your mind. When it comes to consent, consent also means I can change my mind anytime I want to. And that should not be negotiated or reversed. So the choice is mine. So it also speaks to change of mind. If someone or my partner or someone asks me to hold my hand and I say yes right now, so if they hold my hand right now, 5 minutes down the line, I change my mind and say no, do not hold my mind, do not hold my hand, or I'm not interested anymore, then, it's important for that person to acknowledge that. So it also speaks about a change of mind.
Yeah, on the issue of gender-based violence, so I'm working with on issues of violence generally. I think gender-based violence is an obvious element in that, but sometimes I find it very hard to define where the boundaries are. So, for example, boys witnessing physical assaults on their mothers or other women in the household, or boys being forced to witness sexual assault in the household. I think one could say that possibly that should be included within gender-based violence. The rape of boys. So I find it quite hard, and I'm not actually in my work attempting to draw a very clear line, because sometimes these things are quite hard to pin down as to where, look, violence has a strongly gendered, wherever one is, I think there's always, violence always has a stronger gender element. Does that make all violence gender-based violence? I don't think so. It would diminish the usefulness of that concept, but it is also hard to pin it down.
So we've got time for 1, 2 more questions, right? But quick questions.
Thank you so much. My name is Karen Reese, and I work for an organization called Mosaic, and we work specifically with victims and perpetrators of domestic violence and victims of sexual violence. So I have one question and one comment, and I'll keep them brief. The first question is, what is the role of civil society organizations within higher education spaces? And that's a question for all three of you. We have vast experience in non-profit organizations and non-governmental organizations that can come into spaces and assist with information and education. The second is about spaces. I have a feeling that we're overthinking these spaces. And I'm saying that because I think that the concept of gender-based violence, not just sexual violence, but gender-based violence and issues of gender equality, need to be everyday conversations, not conversations reserved for a workshop. So when there are a group of students, why can't we just ask the question, what are your thoughts about gender-based violence? I think it's a conversation that needs to happen like any other conversation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Neo. I'm from the Safety and Violence Initiative, and this is a question for Dr. D and Stella. I think it's wonderful that we're talking about sexual violence and gender-based violence, and we're doing things to try and combat that. But another very important issue that's being raised is intimate partner violence, and that's actually quite big at universities as well. And I just wanted to know, is there an initiative or some research, whether they're part of the other initiatives you're working on that focus on emotionally and physically abusive relationships that students are in? Yeah.
So we're going to give each colleague just 2 minutes to respond in any which way they want to.
Let me just start. As Crispin said, that there's a very thin line between when you start to say this is sexual violence, this is gender-based violence, and we're finding that you would come up thinking you're discussing sexual violence, but then it ends up being intimate or being emotional and being whatever, and there isn't a plan of separating. Instead, everything else is inclusive. That's what we've experienced, and as you rightly indicate, that that's also as high. And so that's the intention. It's not to separate. And then on the issue of the other sectors, for instance, when I introduced SAT, I said it's multi-sectoral entity. When we started, we opened it up, and people were coming. We had people that the pastor that is around the university coming, and so it's open because we realized that not a single person, even when it comes to even members. I remember. Once it was announced on campus that people were saying there are quite a number of people that are coming from the health sector, and we said anyone and everyone who is concerned about this has to come. And yes, you are right, it has to be a daily thing. That is why we're saying let's tackle the rape culture. And tackling it doesn't take a workshop. It changes, you have to, your everyday anything that you say, your behavior, your everything. So the more we're hoping that the more people are exposed, then those people, the bystander interventions that both Tanya, my PhD student, and Stella are talking about, is saying, as peers, they don't have to wait for the workshop. That's what we are trying to create.
Just to add on what Sine has already said, that the intimate partner violence aspect is inclusive of the entire component of the GBV education and awareness that happens. It's of course disseminated through role plays, through case scenarios, and it comes up during the discussions that happen. But because time is always an issue, you know, these issues and topics are really wide that often you have limited amount of time to unpack everything during a discussion. But yet, yes, it is part of the inclusive education that is happening, and yes, we would like to have more of the intimate partner education happening as well, and awareness. The other aspect about why can't we just ask these questions, you know, on a daily basis? Why does it have to wait for a workshop? It really doesn't have to. You know, we wish that most of our students, or we'd like nearly all our students to engage in these discussions. But I think, and this is just my opinion, the reality is that some of the students out there don't really know much about what these aspects are, what these concepts mean, really unpacking them, and what the implications are. So having a discussion about the issue doesn't really come, you know, automatically for them. And I think because they're all so caught up in all the academics and all the commitments on campus, the studies would, conversations or debates or discussions about their studies will take center stage. But I believe the protests and the initiatives now that are coming up, and the action that is being taken is really invoking thought and allowing students to think about these discussions, and encouraging them that these discussions need to happen. We don't have to wait for a workshop. So I think we're getting there. We need to do more. Yeah.
Just on the point of overthinking spaces, I refer to the Cornerstone module, which was taken this year by about 2,000 students, and next year it'll be about 2,500. We're trying to draw these conversations totally into that module, and partly because we're using a lot of student narratives of experience, in which a very wide range of issues to do with, in our context, a lot of what they're writing about is violence. And so we're trying to create the opportunities for the interrogation, you know, raising questions about this, trying to draw the work of these two groups. So on Monday we had, in the teaching of there were about 200 students, the one young woman from Gazva who spoke extremely strongly and directly to students on what she as a woman really needs from other students. And the two young men from Amajita speaking about the issues they face as men and what they're trying to achieve. So we need also, I think, to look at where are there the resources outside that we could draw into this as well. It's something we've got to think further on.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I think it was great to hear about some of the initiatives that's happening on our university campuses, and I'm sure the conversation will continue after and during the lunch as well. And we really thank you for sharing these initiatives with us, and we wish you well with this excellent and extremely important work that you're doing on campuses. So colleagues, let's just thank them. Thank you so much. It's lunch now, and so we've got about an hour's break, and then colleagues can come back for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you.